actually impacts interest rates? Is it the Fed or is it Treasuries?
Okay, first of all, what affects mortgage rates, let me be very clear, is the bond market.
Right.
Okay? Why there's a big disconnect in the general public about because of all the stupid political narratives right now, people tend to think that like, oh, the Federal Reserve can control your mortgage rate. No, for the love of God, no, that's not how it works. The Federal Reserve's rates that you hear about, all this, hype about the, Powell and the rates, right? The rates that they're talking about is the overnight lending rate between the Fed and banks.
The Fed funds rate.
Yeah, that's the Fed funds rate. It is the overnight lending rate. It's when a bank needs to go to the Fed and say, I'm short on cash right now, I need to borrow for 1 day.
Right.
That is the shortest term in duration interest rate, overnight rate. Okay? What is your mortgage rate? How many years does it go out sometimes?
30 years.
That's the long-term rate. But the market uses the 10-year treasury rate as the gauge of the mortgage market, because more than likely a mortgage goes only for 10 years. Does that make sense? Before you refi it or you sell your house or whatever, right? So they use a 10-year treasury. Now the 10-year treasury rate is 10 years in duration. The Fed funds rate is what? Overnight.
Right.
One night, 10 years. You see the difference? Okay? So there's this thing that you hear the curve you hear about.
The yield curve.
The yield curve, right? What does that curve mean? 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Here's the bottom. It's a graph, right? It's curve, right? What is this axis? Is duration. You have 1 day all the way up to 30 years. So there's this curve, right? When you
the
lend
longer, the higher the rate.
Exactly. So when you lend money to your neighbor, hey man, can I borrow $10 for a day? Like, oh, 1 day, sure, give him back $10 tomorrow. You're gonna charge him nothing, maybe, right? But he says, hey man, I need to borrow $10 for 10 years. You're like, dude, if you're gonna keep $10 for not paying me back in 10 years, I want a good return. Right? So what does that tell you about the curve? The returns on the super short term is much lower. There you go. It's the curve, right? But
how do treasuries impact the mortgage rates?
Why does treasuries impact the mortgage rates is the question more. Because what happens to most mortgages in this country?
You said like they get refied after 10 years or...
No, what happens to a mortgage? You're a mortgage broker.
Mortgage-backed securities.
You're a mortgage broker.
Yes.
When you go do a deal for a client, then they want a 30-year fixed or a 10-year fixed and all that, right? What do you think happens to that loan?
It gets repackaged on the secondary market and
Okay.
sold as a mortgage-backed security.
Correct. So the mortgage-backed securities rate is equivalent to the 10-year treasury rate. Who determines that rate? The market determines the rate.
Demand.
The demand. What happens when the demand? What happens when the demand for a 10-year for something goes up? Price goes up, right? What happens to the rate? What happens to the interest rate when the price of the security goes up? It goes down. That's why Trump tries to tries to push for buying $200 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities, because that raises the price of it. The market determines the rate. So if you go push demand into that market, it drives the price up, it brings the rate down. That's why. Now you got, see, like, it's got nothing to do with the Fed, people. It's got nothing to do with the Fed. The Fed's effect, whatever the Fed does affecting the long-term mortgage market, is because when the Fed moves rates up or down, it sends a message that what it feels about the economy. And that's like an indirect effect on the mortgage market, but it's not a direct effect. Whatever Powell does not directly affect the mortgage market. Look at what happened in the last 2 years when they started bringing rates down.
Every time we do a rate